Okay, so you can go ahead.
Okay.
I'm recording.
Okay. Rhododendrons are a plant for all seasons. Rhododendrons, as you're well aware, have very showy flowers. They're one of our few broadleaf evergreens, and they like acidic soils, which we have an abundance of in the Atlantic provinces. The first slide shows some rhododendrons in the Halifax Public Gardens. So when we're looking at these slides of the various flowers, the various rhododendron plants, I'd also hope that you actually look at the surroundings. Here in the public gardens, you can see that the rhododendrons are protected, have a windbreak of large trees in the background, but they're not overshadowed by any trees. You can also notice the shape of the large pink rhododendrons. They're broader than they are tall, and they're probably 10 feet tall. The next slide from the public gardens shows azaleas. The azaleas, again, they have a background of deciduous trees as a windbreak, and the azaleas are smaller plants. They have a different range of colors, and particularly in the yellow, the orange, and the reds, which are not as commonly seen in the larger leaf rhododendrons. On the next slide, I point out that sometimes I say rhododendrons and sometimes azaleas. All of the plants, both the azaleas and the plant I called a rhododendron, are rhododendrons. They're both in the genus Rhododendron. There are various general differences between rhododendrons are generally larger plants, thicker trunks, leathery leaves, and they have 10 or more stamens. While azaleas tend to be smaller, more delicate plants, they may lose their leaves, but the technical biological difference is that they have 5 stamens. But all of the plants that we'll be talking about are rhododendrons. In the next slide, we're looking at not only do rhododendrons have showy flowers, as you see in the bottom picture, but also some rhododendrons have very showy buds, and that they make it a strong textural interest. And you can see in the upper picture, first the buds swell, and then they actually turn bright pink, so adding weeks of interest to the flowers. But one of the things that are most interesting about rhododendrons are the leaves. And the next slide shows John Brent and his garden on Morris Island, which is down near Yarmouth. It has a slightly warmer climate than most of people in the Atlantic provinces deal with. And he's able to grow these plants with the giant leaves. However, in the next slide, there are pictures of leaves from my garden, which is in Halifax. And the first leaf by the ruler is the leaf that John Brent had in his hand. And adjacent to it are leaves from the rhododendrons in my garden. And you can see that there's a great diversity of sizes. But one of the most interesting things about rhododendron leaves that we'll see in the next slide is that rhododendrons have adapted to living in cold climates. How is it possible that they're one of the few broadleaf evergreens that can live in climates that are as cold as we have in the Atlantic provinces? They do 2 things. The leaves go from being perpendicular to the stems to parallel, and they roll. What they're accomplishing by this is when the leaves, if you hold one of the leaves perpendicular to the stem the way it is during the summer, and what'll happen is the leaf will turn brown and it won't be able to photosynthesize the next year. And the curling also has a purpose. It makes it creates a slightly warmer temperature within the leaf, but enables the leaf to thaw out slower, so the cells are not damaged. So this unusual response to the cold is how rhododendrons manage to survive in our climate. And it also gives one a way of looking out at the window in the wintertime and saying, oh, it must be at least -4°C because my rhododendron leaves have rolled. In the next slide, the broadleaf rhododendrons come in two classes. The smaller leaf plants are called lepidotes. They're little leaves, and if you had very good eyesight and you looked at the underside of the leaf, you would see there are scales on it. The larger leaf, broadleaf or rhododendrons are called elepidotes, or without scales. And these are considerations that we will talk about when considering which rhododendrons to plant where in your yard. As we move on, considering the leaf, rhododendron leaves not only are shiny, but some of them have a soft coating on them. And if the coating or the fuzz is on the top of the leaf, it's called tomentum. If it's underneath, it's called indomentum. This tomentum and indomentum provides protection for the leaves in various ways. It helps with respiration, and it also provides some protection for insects. But for the gardener, it adds an extra dimension, more texture in the garden. Moving on, we're going to be looking at some rhododendrons lose their leaves. A plant such as Rhododendron slippenbachia, the royal azalea with its pure pink flowers, has an extra degree of interest. In the fall, its leaves turn a spectacular pinkish red. So we're now going to look at rhododendrons through the season. Because rhododendrons are broadleafed, the snow sits on them and making interesting patterns in the wintertime. However, if the snowfall we have is very wet and it's going to turn to rain and freeze, I would use a broom and gently sweep the snow off. The next slide looks at rhododendrons in the spring. And you can see the azaleas in Pine Grove Park in Liverpool are making a fantastic display in a range of bright colors: oranges, yellows, pinks, whites. In the lower corner, we're looking at lepidotes in a garden by the sea. And this garden is windy. These smaller lepidote plants are more suited to that area. They make nice rounded shapes and are able to withstand windier conditions. In the next slide, we're going through the seasons. We're looking at rhododendrons in the summertime. By this time, most of the blossoms are gone, but when the red arrow shows a rhododendron with indomentum, making a very nice textural interest in a garden where there are no longer flowers, but there's certainly lots of interest. In the following slide, we'll be looking at some gardens from members of the Atlantic Rhododendron and Horticultural Society. And in the vertical picture, you can notice that there are small trees above the rhododendrons and you're getting filtered lights. They're designing a lot with a combination of rocks and rhododendrons, making a very beautiful pictures. If we move on to the next picture and we look at a garden, again, this is the same garden. Here, the deciduous trees have been limbed up. The plants are kept at a very small scale. They're very closely, very carefully aligned. This is a very sophisticated, very beautiful garden. We can look at another garden in which there's a slightly different design theme. Here we're looking at one in Mahone Bay, and they have very broad sweeping lawns. The rhododendrons are planted with small evergreens, perennials. The garden is protected by around the edges by a deciduous forest. The next slide from the same garden shows how the rhododendron, the garden changes with time. The pictures are taken about a week apart, and you can see that There are different plants that are more in bloom in one picture than the other. When you're choosing your rhododendrons, there's normally a piece of information on the tag that says whether they bloom early, middle, or late. You could choose to have a garden in which the plants all bloom close to one period of time, and that would be like having a garden with a still life photograph. Or you could choose to have your garden so that the plants are arranged so that you get blooming over a longer period of time, and you can consider that as in contrast to having a still life photograph. You're making a movie. Again, they're just different design concepts. In the next slide, we're looking at another garden. Again, this garden is in Kingswood, and there's lots of perennials in this picture. But what I wanted you to notice is that the tree trunks that you see are probably hemlocks that have been limbed up, and there's sufficient light there to grow some rhododendrons and a wide variety of perennials. And in the next slide, we're looking at another garden. This is a garden in Dartmouth. It's a slightly smaller scale than some of the gardens we had been looking at. And the plants are very carefully chosen, the small trees, the size of the rhododendrons to be in perfect scale. With the size of the garden, they're using a lot of perennials. There are maples, which make fine contrast with the rhododendrons, particularly in the fall when the Japanese maples turn bright colors, so particularly the red, which contrasts beautifully with the dark green of the rhododendrons. In the next picture, we're going to look at, here's a picture of a garden with a very large rhododendrons. You can barely, in the lower picture, you can barely see a person walking through the garden. Here, we're kind of in a magical fairy forest. This often happens to people who are collectors of rhododendrons. It's a very different look, but one that some people may cherish. But one of the things we have to remember when we're choosing our rhododendrons, and we'll see in the next slide, that rhododendrons grow. How big do rhododendrons get? Well, the rhododendron that you're looking at in this picture is about 30 years old. And John is about 6 feet tall. So you can see the rhododendron is probably 10 to 12 feet tall, and it's wider than it is tall. And in the lower corner, you'll see a picture of John's hand and showing that the growth on that rhododendron is about 8 inches every year. So one has to make choices whether one wants a fast-growing rhododendron or a slow-growing rhododendron. But when you get your label that tells you something about the rhododendron, it'll give you the size, and when it's approximately 10 years old. It does not stop growing at 10 years old. It will continue growing from there. But these large rhododendrons have a particular use in the garden. Gertrude Jekyll, one of the great gardeners from the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the arts and craft movement, pointed out that rhododendrons can make a very good transition from the forest to the garden. And in the next slide, I'll show you the use of this. Again, this is a garden in Kingswood and taken about 10 years ago. You can see there's a shed, and if you look through the trees, you can see the trees, because this garden, like many gardens in new subdivisions, have been cut out of a woodland. The trees don't have leaves down to the ground except on the edge of the forest. So in the corner of the picture, you can see the neighbor's house. In the next picture, we're going to look at the same garden about 10 years later. And you can see the red arrow shows where the shed is, and the neighbor's house is completely gone. So choosing the size of the rhododendron and where you plant it is very important for the long-term look of your garden. The next slide talks about strategies. What kind of garden do you want to have? Let's assume that we have a new bed and we're going to make some choices. If one was very careful and was patient, you could lay out your garden bed and just put in plants that have slow growth and wait patiently for the bed to fill out. Most people don't have that kind of patience. Another choice is you can put in larger plants with faster growth, and within 2 or 3 years, you'll have a very full bed, and the consequences in 10 or 15 years are overcrowding. So another strategy is to put in some smaller, but put in some plants that grow quite large, but intersperse them with plants that are slower growing and not as long lived. The next slide will show an example of this. This is actually an example from my garden in the jars, the Journal of the American Rhododendron Society, and it is probably in California. The plants aren't the same as we would use, but what they show, if we start in the corner, you can see that there are 3 conical conifers at one end. There's a bunch of shrubs and maples, small evergreens that have been placed there. And then at the front of the bed, they put in a number of heaths and heathers as filler plants. They're shorter lived and will not last as long as the bigger plants, but they're providing interest for the first years of growth of this bed. In the next slide, we'll look at the same bed 7 years later. You can see the 3 conical evergreens in one corner, and you can see how much the plants have grown, and it's still a very fine looking border. The next slide just contrasts the 2 beds. So you can see with judicial planting, one doesn't have to do a lot of extra work and still have beds that are very pleasant to look at. We're now going to change tact a little bit, and we're going to look at the actual care and maintenance of rhododendrons. So as I've been mentioning, we're going to start with site selection and, at least thinking about the space that the mature plant will require. Drainage is very important for rhododendrons. If it's a very wet space, they probably will not thrive. We've looked at in the various gardens that many of the gardens that plants, the rhododendrons that we saw, were in full sun. Some of them had light shade from well limbed up deciduous trees. There was some care. If it's a windy site, the lepidote rhododendrons seem to deal with it better. Having a border around the garden with larger trees is very helpful for them. In the Atlantic provinces, often our soil pH is generally acidic. We're probably weak on organics, and you might have to add some additional organics. The next slide. Often when you buy your rhododendron and take it out of the pot, you'll find that it's very root bound. So there are several techniques of dealing with this. The middle slide shows somebody having just cut wedges out of it, and the lower slide shows having dealt with this program by just spraying water with it. So once we have our root ball prepared, we're going to put it in the ground. And the next slide shows an example. Rhododendrons are very shallow rooted, so we're not going to have to dig a very deep hole. Making it a little bit wider and putting in some, augmenting the soil with some organics is probably very helpful. And if the area seems wet and soggy at all, you wouldn't plant the rhododendron flush with the soil, you would raise it a bit. In the next slide, we're going to look at, with a young plant, if you probably bought it when it was in bloom, you would probably remove the flower heads. And the picture in the lower corner shows somebody's thumb and finger, and they've snapped the rhododendron buds off. With a young plant, you don't want it to spend a lot of time developing seeds. You want to make sure that the plant spends its effort developing leaves and roots. With your rhododendrons, we're going to consider a little bit about mulching and fertilizing. Again, rhododendrons are very shallow rooted. So it's very wise to put bark mulch on them. This keeps down the weeds, because, you know, with a shallow rooted plant, you don't want to be removing leaves with a hoe and damaging the roots. They're also, rhododendrons are light feeders. You don't have to worry much about fertilizing them. Azaleas, however, do like a bit of fertilizer, and talking about a handful spread around and away from the trunk. Not a lot of care, and for mulching, after mulching, just fertilizing once to twice a year. And the next slide, we're looking at transplanting. One of the very active members of the Rhododendron Society mentioned that rhododendrons need to be transplanted so often they should be on wheels. Because rhododendrons have a very small root ball, it's relatively easy to dig them up and move them. But after you've done this, you should keep it well watered for the first year. However, if we're careful and we've chose the plant exactly for the size that we think it should be at maturity, we won't have to do this too often. In the next slide, we're going to worry about another. Rhododendrons are usually very vigorous, grow on happily, and but occasionally they will need to be pruned. And some of the first rhododendrons I bought, I went off to see one of their growers, and they would say to me, "Would you like a large plant?" And I'd say, "Oh yes, that's very exciting." Well, now I have very large rhododendrons, and they take up a lot of space in the garden, and one becomes faced with, do I remove it, or do I prune it severely? And one of the other members of the club pointed out that she was working on a site in which there were very large rhododendrons that blocked the view, and they didn't worry very much about the dormant buds. They just cut them back, and within a year they were regrowing. So they're pretty resilient. Next slide. Unfortunately, but not often, rhododendrons develop pests. If you have a plant a sad looking plant, the one that's labeled borer or root rot damage, something is going to have to be done to address this problem, or you're not going to have a rhododendron for very long. You should look at the stems very carefully. And if the stems, as you can see in the center upper picture, are hollow, and you can see that there are larvae in them, you have a serious problem. And it's a little bit difficult to deal with. There are sprays that will deal with this, but you just can't spray on the top of the leaves. You have to get under the leaves and get at the bugs. There are nematodes that will deal with this. However, the bugs, when they chew on the stems, they make a very fine sawdust-like material, and it's difficult for the nematodes to get at them. A more common problem, and one that's easier to deal with, is the black pine weevil. They chew notches in the leaves, and the weevil itself and the larva, which is kind of a white semicircle looking larva, feeds on the roots. They can be dealt with nematodes. You can buy the nematodes at places like Halifax Seed. You apply them in probably in June on a wet day, and you won't get all of them, but you will certainly be able to control the infestation enough so that your plants will thrive. We've already dealt a little bit about cold damage, and if your rhododendron has an iron deficiency, the leaves will turn yellow, but they'll have a bright green veining, and you can buy chelated iron to correct this problem. The Atlantic Rhododendron and Horticultural Society deals not only with rhododendrons, but with companion plants. And there are a number of plants that really enhance a garden. Viburnum plicatum myrisii, the double file viburnum, has spectacular layered branches with flowers in the spring. Plants like Daphne caromaki are very early blooming and scented. There are small trees like the Stewartia, pseudocamellia. They bloom after the rhododendrons, and they have great fall color. Some other companion plants that are recommended by the Society are the Cornus cusus, the Korean dogwood. Again, it blooms generally after the rhododendrons, or maybe the same time as rhododendron maximum in early July. They come in pinks and whites, and they're very long blooming. The fall color is spectacular, and the bark is usually very quite interesting. Of course, the magnolias are well suited to acidic soil conditions. And again, they come in whites, pinks, yellows, various sizes. There's, for gardens that aren't so big, there's a series called the Little Girl series, named after secretaries from the for the botanical gardens in Washington, D.C. Rhododendrons, the smaller ones, look great planted out with perennials, small shrubs, small evergreens. This is just a small selection of companion plants that are available. The next slide shows some others. I think one of the ones that it's most joy to me are the Chinese witch hazels that bloom in February and March. Whenever the temperatures rise above freezing, they open their buds. We have a native witch hazel, but it blooms in the fall. Its blossoms are smaller, and they're usually not as noticeable because the leaves are still on the tree. But I'd highly recommend that one. It's such a joy. Of course, there's the Japanese forest grass that looks great with viburnums. Again, there are early blooming things like the winter hazel. So now the gardens that you have been looking at are overall gardens for members of the Atlantic Rhododendron Horticulture Society that have allowed us to show you pictures of their garden. Special thanks to them all. On to the next slide. The Atlantic Rhododendron Horticultural Society on its website has a list of proven performers, plants that over the years the gardeners from the society have done well in their gardens. They're based on hardiness, bloom time, and height. Remember, over 10 years. And there's a list that are divided into 4 different sections that are shown in the next slide. So we're going to look at the lepidotes, or the very large or elephant leaf plants. The lepidotes. Oh, sorry. Okay, we'll do the lepidotes are the broadleaf rhododendrons with big trusses. They come in pinks and mauves and whites. But there are a few red ones, and the yellow ones are also very choice because there are not as many of them. We also have a selection of lepidotes that are recommended by the club that are considered good doers. These are smaller plants. They'd be lots of pinks and whites and purples. I think the bluey purple is particularly nice in these lepidotes. The next slide shows some azaleas, and in this slide you can actually almost see, in particularly Weston's Innocence, the smaller number of stamens. Maybe you can count them in some of the pictures. The Northern Lights series has a great many colors in it, and though it's back on the other side. Could I go back to? One of my favorites is Pink and Sweet. It blooms quite late. It blooms in my garden, I think, in late July, early August. It's nice to have some azaleas blooming at that time. The next slide is we're going to be looking at the evergreen azaleas. These ones can be quite low growing and hugging rocks to make very nice pictures, especially in gardens that are rather windblown. And finally, the final slide, I believe. If you want more information, you can go to the Atlantic Rhododendron and Horticultural website. The club meets on the first Tuesday of the month, starting in September. Since COVID, most of the lectures have been given as Zoom meetings as well. And I thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much. I think that worked well.
Ah,
Let me just stop the recording.
okay.
Great.